A black man walked into the bodyguard selection for one of the most powerful CEOs in Manhattan. No tailored suit, no impressive resume, just a calm so steady it made the room uncomfortable. Among candidates who looked carved from the same flawless mold, a few of them laughed. They did not need to know who he was. They believed they had already figured him out. A few hours later, the strongest man in that room lay crumpled on the mat in 7 seconds. The laughter was gone. Only one question remained: who truly did not belong here? The apartment was small, the kind of place where the radiator hissed all night, and the walls carried every sound from the street below. Daniel Carter stood at the bathroom sink and ran a razor along his jaw with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who had nowhere to rush but had promised himself he would not be late. The mirror was old, the silver backing spotted and fading at the edges, and taped to the frame was a photograph of a little girl with 2 missing front teeth and a grin that seemed to belong to a world brighter than the one he lived in. Maya was 7. She lived in Philadelphia with her mother, and the photograph had been taken 2 springs ago, back when Daniel had still been able to drive down every other weekend without counting the gas. The custody agreement called for monthly visits and a check by the 5th of each month. He had missed the check for 3 months running. The last time he called his ex-wife had not shouted. She had done something worse. She had sounded tired. On the kitchen counter sat yesterday's coffee, reheated in a pan because the microwave had stopped working in August, and he had not yet decided which was more reckless, buying a new one or pretending he did not need it. He tore half a loaf of bread from the bag, ate it standing up, and drank the coffee black. There was no sugar in the apartment. There had not been for a while. His suit hung on the back of the bathroom door. Black, single-breasted, a little loose at the shoulders, because he had lost weight over the past year without meaning to. He had bought it 8 years ago for his father's funeral and had not worn it since. The night before, he had ironed it on the kitchen table with a towel spread underneath, pressing each seam twice the way a man presses something when the pressing itself is the only part of the morning he can control. His shoes were old, the heels worn down to a slant, but he had rubbed them with a damp cloth until the leather caught the light again. He slid the photograph of Maya from the mirror and placed it face down into the inner pocket of the suit jacket. It was not a ritual. It was simply something he did. A man carried what he was fighting for even when no one was looking. On his phone, a message from the night before waited unread. Maya asks when you're coming to visit. He read it once, closed his eyes for the length of a single breath, and put the phone away. Then he locked the apartment behind him and walked out into the cold, gray morning of Brooklyn. There are men who fight for pride, and there are men who fight because somewhere someone is waiting for them to come home. The second kind do not need to win loudly. They only need to not fail. The Hartwell Financial Building rose 40 stories of tinted glass into the Manhattan sky, and the lobby alone was larger than the entire block where Daniel lived. Polished marble, a fountain that cost more than a year of his rent. Security guards in tailored uniforms whose weapons were hidden, but whose eyes were not. He walked through it the way a man walks through weather. He cannot change, neither hurrying nor slowing, and at the front desk he gave his name to a woman who checked her screen twice before nodding him toward the elevators. The waiting room on the 36th floor held 6 other candidates. All of them looked like they had been selected from the same catalog. Suits that fit, shoulders that filled the suits, haircut that week, resumes sitting in leather portfolios on their knees as if the portfolios themselves were credentials. Daniel took the last open chair, the one nearest the door, and set his hands on his thighs. The man in the middle chair was the largest of them. 6'4", easily 230 pounds of conditioned muscle, with the kind of calm posture that only came from knowing without doubt that you were the most dangerous person in any room you entered. He wore a dark gray suit, cut well enough to move in. His name, Daniel would later learn, was Marcus Shaw. For now, he was simply the man who glanced up, took in Daniel's old suit and worn shoes in one unhurried sweep, and let the left corner of his mouth rise in something between a smile and a dismissal. He leaned toward the candidate beside him and said something low. The other man laughed softly, the kind of laugh that was meant to be heard without being accused of having happened. Daniel did not turn his head. He had been in rooms where men had wanted him dead, and the laughter of strangers in a warm office was not an event. He looked at the far wall where a large print of the Manhattan skyline hung in a brushed steel frame, and he waited. A door opened across the room, and a man in his early 50s stepped out, tall, silver at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than the car Daniel used to deliver packages. His name tag read Richard Blackwood, Vice President, Finance. He was moving toward the conference room with a folder under his arm, and he would have passed through the waiting area without breaking stride, except that somewhere between the water cooler and the door, his eyes found Daniel. The reaction was small, a half step shorter than the last, a tightening at the corner of the jaw. Not recognition exactly. Something closer to irritation, as if he had expected the room to contain a certain number of a certain kind of man, and the arithmetic had just come up wrong. He recovered in under a second. He kept walking, but before he reached the conference room door, he pulled a phone from his inside pocket and typed something short, glancing once back at Daniel as he did. Daniel saw it. He did not react. He filed it away the same way he had once filed the position of every sentry along a compound wall, and he kept his hands still on his thighs. The assessments began at 9 o'clock. They ran them in rotations, physical conditioning in the basement gym, reflex drills with a handheld trainer, scenario analysis in a small room with 3 examiners behind a long table. The examiners were James Coleman, the head of security, a thick-set man of around 58 with the steady, unimpressed eyes of a former Chicago detective, Richard Blackwood, who said little and watched much, and a sharp-featured woman in her 30s named Sarah Preston, who turned out to be the CEO's executive assistant and took notes on a tablet with a speed that suggested she was grading more than recording. Daniel moved through the physical round without drawing attention. He did not push for a top score. He did not flex when the trainer called for grip strength. He simply did what was asked accurately and stepped back. In the reflex drills, his hand caught the signal lights at a speed that made the technician glance twice at the readout before writing it down. The scenario round was where Coleman first looked up at him with something other than professional courtesy. The question was delivered flat. A principal is exiting a restaurant onto a sidewalk at night. The protective detail is 2 people. Describe the threats you scan for in the first 10 seconds in order of priority. The other candidates gave textbook answers: crowd composition, vehicles at idle, line of sight to rooftops. They were not wrong. They were just reciting. Daniel's answer took 12 seconds to deliver and did not contain a single item the others had mentioned first. He began with the faces of the people not looking at the principal because the ones who looked were usually fans. He moved to the hands of everyone within 6 feet because hands killed, not eyes. He spoke about the 2 parked cars with recently started engines visible by the heat shimmer above their hoods on a cold night. He ended with the position of his own partner because a detail that could not see its own second man had already failed. Coleman set down his pen. He did not say anything, but the way he looked at Daniel changed, and that change was louder than approval. Blackwood made a mark on his paper and smiled with only his mouth. During the break, Daniel walked the hallway looking for the restroom, and he passed an alcove near the emergency stairwell where Blackwood was standing with his back to the corridor and his phone pressed to his ear. Daniel did not slow. He did not need to. He caught 3 words as he went by, and the words did not matter individually. What mattered was the tone. Not this week. Next week as agreed. The voice was tight controlled and entirely unlike the easy executive voice Blackwood had used in the conference room. Daniel kept walking. He remembered it. He did not mention it to anyone. The field narrowed to 3 by late afternoon. Shaw, Daniel, and a lean former Secret Service agent named David Reyes. They were brought back into the large conference room, and this time the CEO herself came in with them. Victoria Hartwell was 45, composed in the particular way of women who had learned young that composure was a form of armor. Her husband had died 2 years ago in what the police had called a single-vehicle accident on a wet road outside Greenwich. She had never quite believed that sentence. 3 weeks ago, she had begun receiving emails from an address that changed each time and a sender who knew too many details about her schedule. Her longtime personal bodyguard had resigned without explanation 14 days earlier. These were the facts she carried into the room, and none of them showed on her face. She studied the three finalists in turn. She looked at Shaw longest, then at Reyes, and then at Daniel, and her eyes on Daniel stayed one beat longer than they had on the others. Not because she recognized him. Because of the three men standing in her conference room, only one was not trying to be seen. The other two were performing competence. Daniel was simply present. She informed them that the final round would take place the next morning, a direct sparring assessment, one-on-one under supervision. No scores, no points, only a result. Shaw smiled when she said it. He looked across at Daniel, and the left corner of his mouth rose again. Daniel looked back. He did not smile. He did not glare. He simply looked at Shaw the way a man looks at weather on the horizon, registering it, measuring it, and returning to his own path. When Victoria turned to leave, Blackwood walked a step behind her and spoke just under his breath. The words were soft enough that the candidates were not meant to hear. Sarah Preston heard. Daniel, whose hearing had been trained in places where survival depended on it, heard too. I think Shaw is the more sensible choice. Carter has gaps in his record. Victoria did not answer. She walked to the elevator and the doors closed on her back, and whatever she was thinking, she kept to herself. That night, Daniel returned to the apartment in Brooklyn. He took off the suit and hung it carefully on the back of the bathroom door. He sat on the edge of his bed and held his phone and watched the screen until Maya's face appeared and her voice came through the small speaker, bright and urgent and full of questions. "Daddy, are you going to get the new job tomorrow?" He smiled for her. "I'm going to try, baby." When the call ended, he did not set the phone down right away. He sat in the dark for a long time, looking out the window at the skyline of Manhattan across the river, and he listened to the voice that had never quite stopped speaking in the back of his head. It was the voice of a man named Marcus Ellison, who had died in a valley outside Kandahar, with Daniel's name as the last word he spoke into a radio. Daniel had made a promise in that valley, not out loud, but in the place where real promises are made. He had promised that no one under his protection would ever die again. Tomorrow he would need that promise to still be worth something. You will not always need to argue against the way others see you. Sometimes it is enough to be steady enough that their judgment cannot define you. The training room on the basement level of Hartwell Financial had been built for executives who wanted to believe they still moved like younger men. White padded walls, a wide mat of dense blue foam in the center, a row of heavy bags along one wall that looked in the bright overhead light like hanging bodies. The air smelled faintly of rubber and floor cleaner, and when Daniel walked in at 10 minutes to 8 the next morning, Coleman was already there, arms folded, standing at the edge of the mat, the way a referee stood at the edge of something he had seen too many times to be impressed by. Shaw arrived 2 minutes later in athletic clothes that fit him the way confidence fits a man who has earned it. Reyes followed. Then Blackwood, already dressed for the boardroom he would move to afterward, and finally Sarah Preston with her tablet. Victoria came last. She did not sit. She stood at the far end of the mat, with her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and she watched. Reyes went first. He squared up against Shaw with the practiced economy of a former agent, and for a little over half a minute, the exchange was even enough that no one in the room could have called it. Then Shaw found the opening he had been waiting for, swept Reyes's lead leg, and put him on his back in a way that looked almost gentle from a distance. Reyes stayed down for a breath, sat up, and did not argue. He understood what had happened. Shaw turned on the mat. He rolled his shoulders once loose and unhurried and looked across at Daniel. "You sure you want to come up here, friend?" The left corner of his mouth rose. Daniel did not answer. He removed his suit jacket and folded it with the same slow care he had used on his shirt the night before, setting it on a chair at the edge of the room so that the creases would not crush. He unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled the sleeves of his shirt to the middle of his forearms, 2 even turns on each side. Then he stepped onto the mat. In boxing, a man tells you who he is in the first half second. In the kind of work Daniel had done, he told you sooner than that. Shaw told Daniel everything he needed to know in the way he settled his weight onto his front foot and dropped his chin by a degree too far. He was going to open with a left hook because left hooks were what had won his last 3 cage fights, and because he had never fought a man who did not think of a left hook as a beginning. The referee Coleman raised a hand, looked at both men, and dropped it. Shaw's left hook came at Daniel exactly the way Daniel had read it. It was a good punch. It had put better men than Reyes on the ground. It traveled in a tight arc from his hip to where Daniel's jaw should have been, and Daniel's jaw was no longer there. He had pivoted a quarter turn on the ball of his right foot, not far, just enough. His left hand caught Shaw's wrist at the end of the arc, the way a man catches a door that a child has swung too hard, and for one suspended moment, Shaw's own momentum became the only force in the room. Daniel did not add to it. He only redirected it. He turned under the arm, rolled the captured wrist up and behind Shaw's shoulder, stepped through with his hip, and brought Shaw down to the mat with a controlled drop that finished with a knee resting, not pressing against the side of Shaw's neck. 7 seconds. Shaw did not know in that first breath what had happened to him. His eyes were on the ceiling and his chest was rising fast and his right hand was still moving in the position where Daniel's jaw used to be. Daniel held him there for the length of one exhale, felt the fight drain out of the arm he was holding, and released him. He stood up. He offered his hand. Shaw looked at the hand for a moment and then he took it and Daniel pulled him to his feet. The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has happened that no one in them knows how to narrate yet. Blackwood's pen was motionless above his pad. Sarah Preston had stopped typing. Reyes, who had been given the dignity of being beaten by a cage champion, was now watching a cage champion being put down by a man in rolled shirt sleeves who had not even raised his voice. Coleman nodded once. It was a small nod. It was the nod of a man who had spent 30 years in law enforcement and had just watched a technique that did not belong to any civilian curriculum he knew. Victoria said nothing at first. She looked at Daniel for a long moment, and then she looked at Shaw, and then she looked at Blackwood, and whatever she was measuring, she measured without hurrying. She thanked them for their time in a voice that gave nothing away, and she left the room. The interesting thing is never the victory itself. The interesting thing is the way a single moment can reverse the direction in which human beings look at each other. Prejudice does not vanish in that moment. It is only forced to step back before something it cannot argue with. In the changing room afterward, Daniel was unrolling his sleeves when the door opened behind him. Shaw walked in with a towel around his neck and stopped a few feet from Daniel's bench. He did not look angry. He did not look sullen. He looked mostly curious. "Where did you learn that?" Shaw asked. Daniel buttoned the cuff at his left wrist. "Somewhere they don't let you lose," he said. Shaw considered that. He nodded slowly the way men nod when they have just understood a sentence they cannot repeat to anyone else. He put out his hand for the second time that morning, and when Daniel took it, the grip was different from the one Shaw had offered on the mat. It was the grip of a man who had decided something. "If you end up staying," Shaw said, "and you ever need a second pair of eyes, call me." He walked out before Daniel could answer, which Daniel thought was the most honest way he could have said it. By 10 o'clock, Daniel was in Victoria Hartwell's office on the 38th floor, seated in a chair across a desk wider than a dining room table. The city lay behind her in a window that ran from wall to wall. She did not bother with pleasantries. "You're hired," she said. "Blackwood doesn't want you hired. He thinks your record has gaps. He's right that it does. Tell me in one sentence why I shouldn't listen to him." Daniel did not answer quickly. He did not answer cleverly. He said, "I don't have anything to prove to you, ma'am. I can only do the work." She studied him. Whatever she saw, it satisfied something in her that cleverness would not have satisfied. 2 weeks, she said. Probationary. You report to Coleman. You have no executive authority. You shadow my detail, and at the end of 2 weeks, we revisit the arrangement. Daniel nodded once. He stood. At the door, he turned back. "Ma'am, if you don't mind my asking, why are you hiring private protection at all?" She looked at him across the desk. For the first time that morning, something moved behind her composure. Not fear exactly, but the shadow of a reason a woman of her position kept hidden from men she had not yet decided to trust. "Because," she said, "someone has been writing me letters that know things they shouldn't. And because my last man quit without telling me why." She did not say anything else. Daniel did not press. He closed the door behind him on his way out. That evening at 18 minutes past 9, a pressure sensor on a service door in the parking sublevel logged an open and close cycle of 11 seconds. No badge was scanned. No one appeared on the corridor camera that covered the door. Coleman, reviewing the nightly logs from his office on the 37th floor, frowned, muttered something about aging hardware, and flagged it for maintenance. Daniel saw the flag the next morning. He asked to review the camera footage for the 11-second window. The footage, when it loaded, showed the corridor clearly for 4 hours on either side of the event. Within the 11 seconds themselves, the feed was not missing. It had been replaced. Someone had overlaid an earlier empty segment of corridor onto the live timestamp. A civilian watching the tape would not have noticed. Daniel was not a civilian. He noticed because the shadow of a fluorescent light flicker on the wall at second 6 matched the flicker pattern from a loop he had already seen at 7 minutes past 9 that same evening on a different corridor. He did not tell Coleman not yet. He walked down to the service door in person and knelt beside the lock plate. The paint around the plate was intact, but the seating screws had been loosened and retightened at a slightly different angle, the kind of mistake a man made when he was working in a hurry with gloves on. Daniel did not touch anything. He photographed the angle of the screws with his phone and went back upstairs. He began quietly to put things together. The bodyguard who had resigned without explanation. The emails that knew too much about Victoria's schedule. A phone call in a stairwell alcove where a vice president had used a voice he did not use in the conference room. A sentence murmured to the CEO in an elevator lobby, engineered to plant doubt about the one candidate who had noticed the phone call. And now a service door that had been opened without a badge on the same night an experienced executive was dining at a restaurant 14 blocks away with a potential investor. None of it was a case. A detective would have thrown him out of the room. But Daniel had learned in another life that the first sign of an operation was never a piece of evidence. It was a pattern of small mistakes made in the same hand. He took what he had to Coleman late the following afternoon. Coleman listened all of it without interrupting, which was itself a kind of respect. When Daniel finished, Coleman sat for a moment with his hands folded on his desk. "You have a feel for it," Coleman said. "I'll give you that. But feel isn't evidence. If I bring Blackwood's name up to the board with what you just told me, I don't have a case. I have a complaint from a probationary hire about his boss's boss." "I'm not asking you to bring it up," Daniel said. "I'm asking you to tighten the detail. I'm asking you to run Mrs. Hartwell's route changes through you first, not through Blackwood's office. For 2 weeks, that's all." Coleman looked at him a long time. "You know that if you're wrong about this, you'll be out of here by the end of the month. And if you're right and we don't move fast enough, someone dies." "I know." The door to Coleman's office opened at that moment, and Blackwood walked in the way he always walked in, as if the building itself were a hallway in his own home. He carried a folder. He smiled at Daniel with only his mouth, and his eyes went to Coleman. "Am I interrupting?" "No," Coleman said smoothly, closing the file in front of him. "Carter was just walking me through his first week observations." "Ah." Blackwood's smile widened slightly. "New hires. They see danger in every shadow. It passes." The sentence was pleasant. Its edges were not. Daniel rose, thanked Coleman for his time, and left the office. As he walked out, he felt Blackwood's eyes on the back of his neck, and he did not turn around. That night, Daniel sat in his parked car in the employee lot for nearly an hour before he drove home. The engine was off. The windshield was beaded with a light rain that had begun at sunset and had not yet committed to becoming a storm. He watched the lights of the building, and he thought about a valley outside Kandahar, and about the voice that had said his name for the last time through a radio on a frequency he could still hear in his sleep. He had promised that no one under his protection would ever die again. It was the only promise he had ever made to a dead man, and he had kept it by not protecting anyone for 9 years. Now he was back inside the circle, and he had a probationary badge, and he had a vice president who was almost certainly arranging the death of the woman paying his salary, and he did not have time to be right in the slow way that courts demanded. He took his phone from his jacket and dialed a number he had not dialed in 4 years. A man who had served beside him in the same unit answered on the 3rd ring. Daniel did not say hello. I need you to look into someone for me. Quietly. His name is Richard Blackwood, Vice President at Hartwell Financial. I want finances. Real ones, not the ones on paper. There was a short silence on the other end of the line. How fast you yesterday? I'll call you tomorrow. Daniel ended the call. He sat for another moment looking at the photograph of Maya that he had taken from his inside pocket and placed on the dashboard. Then he put the photograph back in his jacket, started the engine, and drove home. The call came the next day at 4 in the afternoon. $8 million, his friend said. Not bank debt, private debt, the kind that doesn't get renegotiated. He's been hemorrhaging into a hedge position for 2 years, and the position went upside down last quarter. Whoever he owes, they don't send letters. Are you going to tell me what this is about? Not yet. Daniel. I will. Thank you. He hung up. He stood in a conference room on the 37th floor with his back to the door, and he looked out at the city, and he understood now what kind of operation he was inside of. A man who owed $8 million to people who did not send letters did not plot a small theft. He plotted one large event that solved everything at once. And the only event large enough to do that in this building was the death of Victoria Hartwell. The event came 2 days later. Victoria had a charity dinner scheduled at the Pierre, an off-site engagement she attended every year. The route had been set for a week. Her driver was to bring the car up from the main garage entrance on the east side, where the detail could observe the loading from a well-lit exterior lane. Coleman had approved the route personally. At 2:30 that afternoon, the route was changed. The revised schedule, which reached Daniel only because Sarah Preston, who had begun without discussing it to copy him on things he was not supposed to see, forwarded it to him, routed the car through a lower service level and out a side exit that crossed beneath the building through a concrete tunnel. The stated reason was a water main repair on the east side entrance. There was no water main repair. Daniel checked in 9 minutes. The request to change the route had come from Blackwood's office, signed off as an efficiency measure, and stamped at 2:12 that afternoon. Daniel called Coleman. Coleman did not pick up. He was in an elevator moving between floors. Daniel called Shaw. Shaw picked up on the first ring. I need you in the parking sublevel in 6 minutes, Daniel said. South Lane. Bring whatever you're carrying. On my way. Daniel did not take the elevator. He took the stairs. He moved down 19 flights at the steady, measured pace of a man who had learned a long time ago that panic burned oxygen a body was about to need. He came out onto the sublevel as the black sedan with Victoria in the back seat was rolling slowly toward the mouth of the service tunnel. The driver was her regular man, an older former patrol officer named Hank. The tunnel lights ahead were dim. The side corridors branching off it were dimmer. In the recessed alcove 30 feet into the tunnel, 2 men were standing in a way that only trained men stand when they are waiting. Daniel did not shout. A shout would have tipped them. He moved along the left wall of the tunnel at a pace that looked from the sedan's rear-view mirror like a building employee walking briskly to his car. One of the men in the alcove turned his head a fraction of a degree not toward the car, toward a dark corner of the ceiling where the camera housing was mounted. He was checking for a cue. He was waiting for a signal from whoever was watching the feed. That glance told Daniel everything. The first man stepped out of the alcove with a compact suppressed pistol coming up from the hem of his jacket, and Daniel was on him before the pistol cleared the fabric. The strike to the inside of the elbow was short and immediate. The pistol dropped, and Daniel's second movement swept the man's legs out from under him and put him face down on the concrete, with his own weapon sliding across the floor. The second attacker turned toward the sound they had been told to expect. Only the driver and the principal and his pistol was already up. The first shot went wide because the man had not had time to set his feet. It hit the concrete behind Daniel's left shoulder. The second shot never came because Daniel had already closed the distance and driven the heel of his hand up under the attacker's jaw, taking him off balance long enough to strip the pistol from his grip. Daniel fired once, low, deliberate, into the man's thigh, and the man went down, screaming. Hank had stopped the car. He was out of the driver's seat with his service weapon drawn, the old habits coming back in an adrenaline burst, and he had the second attacker covered before Daniel had even turned around. In the back seat of the sedan, through the dark-tinted glass, Victoria Hartwell sat very still with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed in a way that Daniel would remember for a long time. A woman who had already lost a husband to what had probably been no accident. A woman who, in the moment she understood that she was about to die, had chosen not to let it show on her face. She looked at Daniel through the window. She did not nod. She only held his eyes for a count of 3, and then she breathed out, and then she looked away. Shaw arrived from the stairwell 20 seconds later. Coleman came 4 minutes after that with 2 armed men from the overnight shift, and after that the police, and after that, a long set of hours in a small room on the 37th floor during which Daniel answered the same questions 4 different ways and never once raised his voice. The attackers would not talk. But the man on the ground, in the first instant of realizing his leg would not carry him home, had glanced up again at the same dark corner of the ceiling, at the same camera, toward whoever had been watching, and toward whoever had just seen the operation fail. Daniel had not missed that either. There are times when you are not permitted to choose your circumstances. You are only permitted to choose who you are inside them. And sometimes doing what is right does not bring you recognition in time. But if you wait to be recognized before you act, the moment when acting still mattered will already have passed. Daniel did not walk into the board meeting the next morning and accuse Richard Blackwood of attempted murder. He understood in a way that Coleman had tried to explain, and in a way that did not need explaining, that the word of a probationary hire against a 15-year vice president was not a case. It was a complaint, and complaints in buildings like this one were handled by men like Blackwood. So he did something quieter. He built a room Blackwood would walk into on his own feet. The morning after this parking garage, he sat in Coleman's office for 2 hours with the door closed. He told Coleman everything his friend from the old unit had found about the $8 million of private debt. He told him about the glance toward the camera. He told him about the loosened screws on the service door, and about the looped footage, and about the 14 days between the old bodyguard's resignation and the first of the threatening emails. Coleman listened the way he had listened the first time, only now his hands were not folded on the desk. They were open flat and very still. When Daniel finished, Coleman stood up and walked to the window. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was lower than it had been the day before. "I've worked in this building for 11 years, he said. "I hired half the men on this floor. And I never once looked twice at Blackwood. That's not on you. That's on me." "It's not on you," Daniel said. "You were inside. When a man stands outside a system, he sees what the people inside have stopped noticing. That's not a virtue. That's just the geometry of where he's standing." Coleman turned from the window. "What do you need?" "I need a room," Daniel said. "One conversation. One piece of rope and enough light on it that he picks it up thinking no one is watching." The rope was this. By the end of that day, a rumor moved carefully through the upper floors, planted in Sarah Preston's calendar, repeated quietly by 2 secretaries who had been told only enough to be convincing. Victoria Hartwell was going to sign a document at 9 o'clock the following evening in her office on the 38th floor. Alone. A personal amendment to a trust arrangement, not a corporate matter, which was why it was happening after hours and without the usual channels. The document would, among other things, transfer control of certain private holdings in the event of her death to a foundation board on which Blackwood did not sit. It was not a document that existed. It only needed to exist in Blackwood's head long enough to move him. Blackwood learned of it at a little after 2 the next afternoon, the way Daniel had intended him to learn of it, through a half-overheard sentence in a hallway, and a glimpse of a line on a calendar that Sarah Preston had left open on her screen when she walked past his office on her way to the copier. By 4, Blackwood had made 3 phone calls. By 6, 2 men had been rerouted from a different job to Midtown. By 8:30, the 38th floor had been quietly emptied of its normal evening staff on instructions Blackwood had given to building services under the guise of a scheduled air handler inspection. At 8:52, the service door in the parking sublevel, the same door that had been opened for 11 seconds on an evening earlier that month, opened again. This time, the camera feed was not looped. This time, the feed was being watched live by Coleman from a small room on the 34th floor. The two men in the stairwell were not the same two men from the garage. These ones did not know what had happened to the first pair. They climbed 4 flights, crossed a hallway, and found Shaw and one of Coleman's overnight men waiting for them in the dark near the elevator bank. The encounter was brief, and neither of the men Blackwood had hired reached the 38th floor. Blackwood, in his own office on the 35th floor, received no signal. What he received instead at 9:04 was the quiet opening of his own office door. Daniel stood in the doorway. He did not step into the room. "They're not coming, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's face did something that no one in the building had ever seen it do. It emptied. He tried for 2 seconds to find the voice he used in the conference room. He did not find it. What came out of his mouth instead was the voice Daniel had heard in the stairwell alcove that first morning of the assessments. "Where are they?" "Downstairs, with Mr. Coleman, and the police are 4 minutes out." Blackwood moved, not toward Daniel, toward the emergency stairwell door at the far end of the executive corridor. He was not a young man, and he was not a trained man, but fear could carry a body for a surprising distance in a short time. He made it to the door. He pushed it open. He stepped through. Daniel was on the other side because Daniel had known which door Blackwood would choose before Blackwood had known it himself. Blackwood stopped in the stairwell. He did not fight. He looked for a long moment at the man standing between him and the descending flight of stairs, and whatever he had been carrying inside himself for the past 2 years came out of his face all at once. He was not a villain in a story. He was a man who had stood at the top of a staircase in his own life and had chosen the wrong flight down. "Do you think you're different from me?" he said. It was not a question that expected an answer. Daniel gave one anyway. "I don't know, sir, but I have somebody waiting for me to come home." There is a kind of despair that walks a good man into a bad corner. It is not an excuse, and the corner is still his to answer for. But if we do not understand how the walking happened, we do not understand anything. We only understand the corner. Blackwood did not cry. Men like him did not cry in stairwells. He only sat down slowly on the concrete landing and put his head against the wall and waited. The arrest took 17 minutes. The 2 men Shaw had intercepted gave up Blackwood's name within the first hour of questioning because men who had been hired for one evening did not carry loyalty past the evening in question. By morning, a forensic accountant from a firm Victoria trusted was already inside Blackwood's private accounts, and by noon the $8 million of private debt had a shape and a pattern, and the pattern was older than any of them had realized. It was in Blackwood's encrypted drives recovered that afternoon that they found the other thing. 2 years earlier, on a wet stretch of road outside Greenwich, Victoria's husband had been driving home alone from a late dinner meeting. A second vehicle had struck his car at an intersection where the traffic light had, according to the report, briefly malfunctioned. The driver of the second vehicle had not been located. The death had been ruled an accident. Blackwood had not arranged that accident himself, but he had known about it. He had known for 18 months that her husband's death had been made to look like one, and he had said nothing because the arrangement had brought the people he owed money to into a position where they could offer him a way out. And the way out, when they offered it, was Victoria. Victoria Hartwell read the file in her office on a gray Thursday morning, and when she set it down, she did not speak for a long time. Sarah Preston was in the room with her. Coleman was in the room with her. Daniel was in the room with her, standing near the window because she had asked him to be there, and he understood why. When she looked up, she looked at Daniel. "Thank you," she said. She did not say anything else for a while because there were things she had waited 2 years to know, and the knowing of them was not relief. It was something deeper and quieter, the kind of thing that rearranged a person without anyone else being able to see the rearrangement happen. Daniel knew that shape. He had carried his own version of it out of a valley in another country, and he had been carrying it for 9 years. Later, when it was only the 2 of them in the room, she told him that she wanted him on a 3-year contract, head of her personal detail, salary that was roughly twice what he would have dared to ask for. She did not ask about his record. She did not ask about the gaps Blackwood had hinted at. "I don't need your past," she said. "I've seen enough of your present." Daniel accepted. He did not make a speech about it. He said thank you, and he shook her hand, and he went down to the lobby and stood in front of the fountain that cost more than a year of his rent. And he allowed himself for the first time since the garage to breathe slowly. On the drive home that night, he called Maya. She answered on the second ring, breathless the way 7-year-olds are breathless when the phone rings during something important. "Daddy, Daddy, I lost another tooth." He laughed. He had not laughed out loud in longer than he could remember. "Which one, baby?" "The one next to the one I lost last time. Mommy says the tooth fairy is coming tonight, and I have to go to sleep at 8, even though it's not a school night, which is not fair." "It's a little not fair," he agreed. "But the tooth fairy has rules." "Daddy, are you coming this weekend?" "Yes, baby, I'm coming this weekend." She made a small, high sound of pure delight, the kind of sound that could light a dashboard from the inside. He drove the rest of the way to Brooklyn in silence, his hand loose on the wheel, and when he reached the apartment, he climbed the stairs 2 at a time for the first time in a year. In the bathroom, he stood in front of the old mirror with the spotted silver. The photograph of Maya with the 2 missing front teeth was still taped to the frame. He slid the photograph free and looked at it. He could hear very faintly the voice of Marcus Ellison in the back of his head, and for the first time in 9 years, the voice was not asking him anything. He did not put the photograph back alone. He opened a drawer beside the sink and took out a small envelope that had arrived a week earlier, one he had not yet allowed himself to open. Inside was a photograph his ex-wife had sent. Maya in a yellow dress, holding his hand at a lake they had gone to in October. He did not remember who had taken it. He remembered the afternoon. He taped the second photograph beside the first so that they shared the frame. Then he put the first picture back into his jacket pocket because a man carries what he is fighting for, and he turned off the bathroom light. A person can be misread in a few seconds. It happens every day in every room in every city. But sometimes a few seconds are also all it takes for the truth to speak for itself. The world does not always listen the first time. It will not always listen the second. But if you can stand steadily enough long enough without needing to argue, the moment will come. Before we are quick to judge anyone, the man in the worn suit, the stranger at the edge of the room, the one who does not look the way we expected him to look, it is worth asking ourselves a small, honest question. Are we seeing who they really are? Or are we only seeing what we have grown used to believing?